We were in New York City at Sirius Satellite Radio working on a resource we would like for you to watch. It is called What Hath Darwin Wrought? You can watch it, no charge, wretched.org/Darwin, and you will see the coolest guy in the world talking about the connection between Charles Darwin, Adolf Hitler, and Joseph Stalin.
When you look at Lenin and Stalin, they're not just Genghis Khan come back. They weren't interested in cheap booty or rape or plunder. They were the servants of an ideological worldview. And that ideological worldview had its antecedents. No honest account will omit Darwin's role, because Darwin's role was immense. I think Darwin's particular contributions to biology are less significant than one generally imagines, but his contribution to human thought, human imagination, more significant. It's not direct, and it would be foolish to say it's direct in the sense that you can point to the origin of species and say anybody reading that is going to be favorably inclined to genocide or favorably inclined to euthanasia or any other dreadful social policy. But look, let's be honest, we're dealing about human beings. Nothing in human life is particularly direct. You can't even say there's a direct connection between Karl Marx, the publication of Das Kapital, and the development of the Soviet economic system. It's crooked. Like everything else about human life, these things are very crooked. But to say that they're crooked, to say that history moves in devious ways, to talk about the cunning of history and the inscrutability of history, is not and should not be to blind ourselves to real, vibrant connections between events that are separated in space and time. If you believe at all that there is such a thing as intellectual history, if you believe at all that ideas do have consequences, and if they have consequences, they have antecedents as well, then you must at least be prepared, as Richard Weikert, a historian who's written widely on this topic, to say what the historical community has always said from 1945 on, that Nazi ideology was Darwinian. It was. They're crying foul because it hits very close to the bone, or it strikes very close to the bone. They're crying foul for two reasons. One, that it's an effective rebuke to the pretensions of Darwinian ideology, the rebuke being that, and Richard Dawkins has said this quite emphatically, if we allow a Darwinian mentality to take over social policy, the result will be fascism. Those are not my words, those are Richard Dawkins' words. And bravo to Richard Dawkins for making that claim. He said quite explicitly he would not accept a Darwinian society because the results would be intolerable. Right he is. But if he can see this clearly, what is to prevent the rest of us from returning to the historical record and drawing the connection between certain kinds of beliefs and attitudes in the 19th century and their full flowering in the 20th, and saying this is a connection every bit as clear to the historical record as Richard Dawkins' moral insight into the imaginary record. Richard Dawkins says, thinking about possible worlds, Darwinian society is a fascist society. By that he means a deplorable society. He didn't really mean fascist. And the historical record says that once certain ideas are introduced, that's all it takes. Once certain ideas are introduced and gain the allegiance of the intellectual class, possibilities in thought and action arise that have never arisen before. Very interesting account in Arthur Koestler, Darkness at Noon, which was published originally in German. Koestler was an Hungarian, and he publishes this remarkable book in German. The German title just escapes me. And he has an imaginary dialogue between the inquisitor and his victim. Rubashov is the victim, Ivanov is the inquisitor. And Rubashov is attempting, as an old communist who has dedicated his life to the revolution, he's attempting to introduce essentially Judeo-Christian scruples into what he personally has done, because he's been guilty of murder on a large scale. And he tries to stutter his way into the Gospels, essentially, thou shalt not kill. And he's embarrassed, he's infirm, he's incapable of making his case articulately, and he knows it. And Ivanov, his articulate, how do you say that word? Interlocutor, my mistake, interlocutor, says something to the effect, yeah, we've knocked off 30 or 40 million people, you're right, so what? We're performing an experiment. The first time any revolutionary has had the courage to admit what he or she is doing. We're experimenting on the suffering body of the human race. So what? Smallpox kills 100 million every year. Why shouldn't we have the same right? Well, that's not classical Marxist doctrine. That's a kind of quasi-medico-philosophical doctrine, which again has certain antecedents in Darwinian thought. Not necessarily, or not at all, in terms of competition between economic classes, although that is there. The competition, the extermination of one class and the replacement by another is, again, just a variant of the Darwinian idea that life is a matter of competition between species. But these characters, imaginary though they are doing something that would never have been possible before. They were upholding a view of what a human being is, in which what is striking is the dismissal of any form of dignity, grandeur, inescapable connection to religious experience, anything that might transcend the simple brute facts of animal experience. And they were doing that quite consciously. You can see it. You can see it emerging. We have the right to do whatever we darn well feel like doing. This is new. This is not a familiar theme in human history. There's a wonderful poem by Matthew Arnold where he talks about the receding sea of faith. And this is very much a 19th century point of view, that the system of thought that girdled the world for almost 2,000 years is receding. It's no longer a credible object of attachment. Not at the end of the 19th century, not at the beginning of the 20th century. Well, what follows from that? What follows when, for example, one thinks of life in terms of physical interactions and not moral interactions of any sort? Well, one thing that follows for sure, and we see that in the 20th century, is a demotion of the human being. And I think that is the theme of the 20th century, the dispensability of the human being. How easy it is to dispense with human beings in the name of a particular ideology. It is not only easy, it's remarkably easy, and no one really knew that before. No one truly understood it. So I think this is one contribution. It's a negative contribution. Charles Darwin, among many other factors, has reduced the credibility of the belief that a human being has an aspect of the divine. There's no question about that. We don't believe it today. When I say we, the general culture no longer believes it. Although it is an incoherent rejection because at crucial moments the general culture wants to believe it. I mentioned healthcare as an example. The general liberal view about healthcare is that healthcare is a right. Agreed? But if you ask, well, why is it a right? Almost immediately people would say, with respect to healthcare but not money, people are equal. They should have equal access to healthcare. Where does the idea of equality come? The ancient Greeks would have scoffed at you. Equal? No. If you're a slave, you get nothing. If you're me, who owns slaves, you get everything. So we are very much under the influence, although we are loath to acknowledge it, that equality remains a right which we cherish but cannot adequately define. Because if we wanted adequately to define the power of equality as a concept, where would we turn? We would turn to the idea of universal brotherhood. All men are essentially equal. In some sense, the Christian tradition is all men are essentially equal in the eyes of God. Well, that is an idea, a specific idea that occurred at a specific moment in time, and neither the Romans nor the Greeks nor the Sumerians would have recognized it. So we have this deep incoherence in our culture. On the one hand, we wish to be upholders of the scientific method, the scientific tradition, the idea that human beings are simply among the physical objects in the universe. And whenever we run into difficulties, whenever we try to justify our moral intuitions, we backtrack in a big hurry.
Oh, imagine my surprise that you're still here. Hey, if you'd like more Wretched, because apparently you've got enough free time, would you like this video? Subscribe to this channel, and we will give you Wretched till it's coming out of your nose.